Hello and welcome. My name is Daniel Parker. I am the Assistant Director on the Special Education team at the Department of Public Instruction. I have with me Paula Volpiansky and Deb Heiss, consultants on the Special Education team at the Department of Public Instruction. Along with us is Sherry Silla from the Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative. And we want to thank WISPE for hosting this webinar. This is the first of a series of webinars on the five-step process for developing college and career-ready IEPs, or CCR IEPs. During our time today, we will provide a brief overview of the 5 core beliefs in the five-step process for CCR IEP development. We will then provide more in-depth information on step 1 of the five-step process, understanding achievement. The five-step process, supported by the core beliefs, will help ensure improved outcomes for students with IEPs. As we go through the presentation today, keep in mind that the five-step process is not about how to fill out an IEP form, but more about a process for having IEP team discussions about improving student outcomes.
CCR-IEP stands for College and Career Ready Individualized Education Program. A CCR-IEP is an individualized education program developed to meet the unique disability-related needs of the student and help ensure the student graduates ready for further education in the workplace. CCR-IEPs are for all students in public school programs aged 3 through 21 who receive special education services. Thus, CCR-IEPs are not just intended for high school students. Rather, CCR-IEPs build knowledge, skills, and habits throughout a student's public school experience, so when they graduate, they are college and career ready. This is an important foundation. This important foundation begins in early childhood. The 5 core beliefs are essential to developing IEPs that promote college and career readiness. It is foundational for families and educators to embrace these 5 core beliefs. Districts and IEP teams should consider and discuss these beliefs. These 5 beliefs are not prioritized, but all are important throughout the College and Career Ready IEP development. The 5 beliefs can have an important impact on the success of students with IEPs. To learn more about the CCR 5 beliefs, there's additional support materials that we'll be developing. The 5-step process of College and Career Ready IEP development provides a framework for IEP team discussion and for operationalizing the IDEA requirements, or Individuals with Disability Education Act requirements. The 5-step process starts by helping IEP teams understand what is the student's academic and functional achievement compared to same age peers. That's step 1. Next, teams identify how the student's disability affects access, engagement, and progress in general education, and why the student may be having difficulty accessing, engaging in, or making progress in general education. The IEP team then uses this information to summarize the student's disability-related needs. Next, the IEP team uses the understand knowledge insights gained from steps 1 and 2 as the basis for the development of measurable annual goals and to align services and supports, which is step 4, to address the student's disability-related needs. In step 5, the IEP team analyzes the student's progress towards the goals to make decisions about whether the services and supports are sufficient to meet the student's needs and revises the IEP team as necessary to ensure adequate progress. As you can see by this description, each step in the process is linked to and informs the next step, so it is crucial for the steps to be completed in sequential order. The process is also cyclical. Thus, step 5, analyze progress, informs step 1, understand achievement, each time an IEP is reviewed and revised. The outcome of the IEP team's conversation and analysis using the 5-step process for developing CCR IEPs is documented on DPI's Sample IEP Linking Form, also known as the I-4 form. An online CCR IEP discussion tool helps IEP team members prepare for these important conversations.
All right, this is Deb. This chart was created to help clarify the main purposes and linkages between the steps in the 5-step process, as well as to highlight the roles IEP team participants play during each step. In the webinar handouts, you have a copy of the full College and Career Ready IEP process chart with descriptions of each step on one side and a blank copy on the other side. The chart can be used both as a training tool when explaining the steps, as well as a place to take notes when developing or reviewing IEPs.
All right, so step 1, what's the purpose? It really is to document in a comprehensive way the student's current academic and functional performance related to access, engagement, and progress in the general education curriculum and environment. So this will include looking at the student's strengths in academic as well as functional performance. That's really critical because in this step, really the IEP team is developing the big picture of the student's current performance. And it is going to provide the foundation for the steps that follow. So it's really critical that this be well developed. The IEP team is going to identify, discuss, and document the student's current level of academic achievement in relation to academic content standards and functional performance in relation to functional expectations for the grade in which the student is enrolled. So in order to complete this step, everyone on the IEP team has to have a voice, and Sherry is going to be giving us some additional information about how to bring forth family and also student voices, because as we said, we want to compile enough information that the team will be able to go on in the other steps that Daniel talked about to discuss the effects and disability-related needs.
The discussion about standards and expectations occurs primarily during step 1. This is how we ensure the IEP is standards-based, and we have included standards-based IEP goals. General education teachers are typically well-versed in the academic standards for which they are responsible, so it is important to include these teachers when developing an understanding of the student's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance in relation to grade-level academic standards and functional expectations. General education teachers are knowledgeable about the standards and how the student is performing in relation to the standards in their classes. This information is best summarized and brought to the meeting rather than having the IEP team try to review all the standards for all areas during the meeting. The latter would not be reasonable. It would be good, however, to always have a copy of the standards at the meeting as a reference, particularly for parents. Specific standards may be highlighted during the meeting when developing the current level statements and will lead to next steps. Please remember, for preschool age children, you will be relating the student's performance to the district's early learning standards and expectations. For students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, you will relate the student's performance to the alternate achievement standards. By focusing on the standards when reporting the student's current levels of performance during step 1, the goals will naturally be aligned with the academic content or early learning standards for the grade in which the student is enrolled. Reminders. The standards drive curriculum instruction, so you must use assessment tools to measure the skills associated with the standards. Students often are meeting some grade level standards across skill areas and not others. For example, a student may be meeting grade level standard in some areas of reading comprehension, but not others. For this reason, IEP goals are related to why the student is not meeting specific standards and are not a restatement of the standards that apply to all students. Other reminders about meeting grade level standards versus measures of student level performance include saying a student is reading at 5th grade level may not accurately reflect a student's overall reading performance in relation to the standards. Grade level performance is usually related to an assessment score that falls in the average range for students of a certain age or grade, or that meets an expected benchmark score for students in a specific grade. When we refer to a student's reading level, we usually are talking about a measure that represents a specific reading skill or skills, such as a score on a reading skill screener, standardized test, or benchmark assessment. Sometimes reading level may reflect data about a student's comprehension or decoding accuracy or fluency reading rate from a running record on a graded reading passage. While it may be accurate to say a student is receiving instruction based on the 5th grade standards, saying a student reading achievement is at the 5th grade level is not the same as saying the student is meeting 5th grade reading standards. A student who is meeting reading standards at a certain grade level will have been assessed on multiple reading skills representing the standards and determined to have met proficiency expectations for students in that grade. Before referring to a student's reading performance as 5th grade reading level, think of what you really mean and provide corresponding information in your documentation. Now Paula will present an example with reading achievement data.
Okay, here's an example of some current level of performance information in the academic area of reading for a 5th grade student, which was collected during the middle of the year. After reviewing the 5th grade standards, the IEP team determined the student was not meeting 5th grade standards in a number of areas. In particular, the student was having difficulty with skills related to the Anchor standard range of reading and level of text complexity. This standard relates to skills required to read and comprehend complex literary and informational texts independently and proficiently. Some of the standards the student was not meeting included the foundational standard, read with sufficient accuracy and fluency to support comprehension, and the literature standard, by the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories, drama, poetry, at the end of grades 4-5 text complexity band independently and proficiently. Please keep in mind these are excerpted examples specific to reading achievement. This is not meant to be an exemplar of a current level statement. In reality, the IEP team may have discussed the student's performance in relation to more of the standards. And in the actual IEP document, we would see more information about other areas of academic achievement as well as functional performance, along with summary explanations of what the data means in reference to grade level standards and expectations. There would also be additional information about student strengths. For example, on this slide, we did have a couple of strengths in there, including comprehension of grade level text when using a text reader and enjoying reading a variety of text at independent levels.
So key ideas. IEP team members are going to need to be familiar with the academic standards and functional expectations for the grade in which the student is enrolled, because you're going to be comparing the student's performance to those standards and expectations. So district standards are good things to look at, and if you have young learners, for our youngest learners, you might want to look at developmental and early learning standards, IDEA preschool outcomes, indicator 7. For learners with the most significant cognitive disabilities, IEP team members should be familiar with the alternative achievement standards, also known as the essential elements, and those are aligned with grade level standards. It's important to note that general education teachers have a lot of knowledge about the standards, and so they are going to be IEP team members who can provide a lot of background information about this. So it's going to be important as the IEP team is documenting this current performance to look at if the student has needs, but also be sure to include areas of student strength. And consider skills needed to access, engage in, and make progress in general education curriculum. So you want to think about skills like attention and self-advocacy and use of assistive technology. What are the things that that student needs to gain access? Critically, as this step is completed, be sure to strive to present information in meaningful ways so everyone on the IEP team understands, including the parents and the student when the student is present. So you're going to want to explain test scores in terms of what the student knows and is able to do compared to his or her peers. This discussion, like so many other things, is going to be documented on the linking form.
This slide was developed as a resource to assist with IEP teams in identifying grade-level academic and functional expectations for students with IEPs. You can click on the link for Wisconsin's academic standards, alternate achievement standards, also known as the essential elements, and these are the standards for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, the Wisconsin Early Learning Standards, as well as Wisconsin social emotional learning competencies. The first three sets of standards, the Wisconsin Academic Standards, Alternate Achievement Standards, and Early Learning Standards, can be used to assist in determining the grade-level academic expectations for the grade in which the student is enrolled. Districts can also use their individual district grade-level academic standards. The Wisconsin Social Emotional Learning Competencies can assist IEP teams in determining the functional expectations in the areas of social emotional development for students as they move from early childhood programs through high school. These social emotional learning competencies will be available on the DPI website on the Social and Emotional Learning webpage in the fall of 2017.
As we've conducted training throughout the state on the five-step process, we are beginning to notice some common potential misunderstandings and maybe some errors that we would say in IEPs. And this slide highlights some of the things that IEP teams should probably really think to include in their IEPs when they document their discussion, and some things that they probably want to avoid. We've created a one-page handout, which I believe is in your handout list, and it's also linked on this screen as well as some of the others. It's called Step 1, Understand Achievement at a Glance. We have developed one-pagers for all of the steps, and that's on the CCR IEP page, which there's a link at the end of this presentation to that page. Okay, so the most important takeaway, and you can read what's on here, and I'm not going to go over all of these items on the slide because hopefully you've been looking at them. I think the most important takeaway for this step is that the team really needs to talk about and have a discussion about sufficient and meaningful information so that everyone who's at the meeting, including the parents, fully understand what standards and expectations we're thinking about with that child's age or grade, and how that student is performing in relation to both those academic and functional standards compared to their grade level peers. Again, this isn't about just filling out the form. This is about having a meaningful conversation where by the end of it, hopefully we will know the student and their needs to the better so that we can really do some more student-specific focus on improving outcomes. A few tips before we provide you with some hands-on practice. I'm going to review some helpful reminders in general, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sherry Silla from WISPE. So first of all, variety of sources. Data and information that is reviewed for the current, this section of current academic achievement and functional performance can include things from grade and district level kinds of things to classroom assessments, age-anchored assessments for those little ones. Monitoring IEP goal progress is always really important. Structured observations and any kind of other data you might be. Again, we're thinking of information about current achievement that will be helpful in our next conversation, which will be looking at how the disability affects the student as well as for developing goals. So we want the data to be helpful for educational planning and goal setting, not just data. The other thing is that we want to make sure that as you're walking in there, you should have reviewed the expectations, grade level standard, the code of conduct. If you have, some districts are developing social emotional learning standards or expectations. For the preschool kids, we already mentioned some of those resources for the students with severe, the most significant cognitive disabilities, the essential elements. To have a really good sense of those, we've been asked out in the field, so does that mean we need to write down all of these standards in somewhere in the IEP document? And the answer is no. You know, obviously the people coming in, and Deb mentioned before, general educators have an important role to play. There should be an awareness of these standards, and the specific standards that we need to talk about clearly relate to this child's disability and other focal points that we want to talk about. But I think the point we're trying to make is the place for discussion about the standards is in step 1. We want all staff, and those of you that may be administrators or program support folks who are online, we want to make sure all staff, including all special educators, understand the standards and expectations for the age or grade that kids are at, and also understand various strategies for how to address academic learning and functional performance. Because that is also important, because during this step, as Deb mentioned, we want to talk about things that are working and strengths, as well as areas that we see concern. Sometimes information about classes that the student, or subjects or topics that the student is doing well in, can give us a lot of insight into why they may not be having success in other areas that may or may not be using similar skills. The final thing I want to say as far as tips is we really need to work to train all of us, all educators, how to collect and share meaningful student data. And that would include how to conduct a comprehensive special education evaluation. I know this today we're not talking about special ed evaluations, but it is critical that we start with a really good comprehensive special ed evaluation that meets the requirements of special ed law in 2 areas. One, it does provide enough information to determine eligibility, but also the other purpose of a comprehensive evaluation is just to identify the needs of the child so that we can move forward with program development.
Another tip relates to engaging students in the IEP process. This slide shows a few ways this can be done. Involving students in the development of their IEPs leads to greater student ownership and understanding of their educational programs and its outcomes. This applies to students of all ages and all developmental levels. All students can and should have a role in their IEPs. Preparing students to participate in their IEP team meetings can begin in seemingly small ways. For example, when preparing younger students, the student's case manager or teacher can have the student be ready to share one skill the student is good at and or one thing they would really like to get better at when prompted during the actual IEP team meeting.
I'm going to turn it over to Sherry, who will talk a little about family engagement.
So I'm going to talk about engaging families in the step 1 process. So in order for families to be a part of the IEP team and process, families need to understand achievement, both academically and functionally. Families need to know about the grade level standards that their child is expected to be working towards. If the student is in the 3rd grade, then the IEP team should share with the family what the 3rd grade standards are. Families need to know what the functional expectations that help the student to access, engage, and achieve grade level standards. Those skills could include working independently, communicating with others, or organizational skills. Families need to understand the educational terms and jargon that is used in the IEP meetings. And finally, families need to have data shared with them that tells them if their child is performing at grade level, above grade level, or below grade level. So how do we have these discussions with families? We ask questions. And so on the slide here, we have some questions that will allow families to contribute to the conversation, and what is shared can actually be linked to the academic grade level standards and functional expectations. So the first question, what is your child good at? When are they at their very best and most happy? This gets to a student's strengths and interests, and oftentimes these can be, those strengths and interests can be leveraged in areas where the student may struggle. The second question, what types of books, texts, movies, and other media does your child enjoy that could support their literacy or other instruction? This question specifically is focused on academics, like reading, as you see, and actually when we focus on those academic areas and we ask questions like that, we can often identify student preferences and interests, which could very well be possible ways and ideas in order to keep a student engaged. And then the third question, how are things going at home in relation to the information we have been discussing at the meeting? So we want to think about asking questions like, so when your son or daughter brings their homework home, what is homework like at home? Is it hard? Is it difficult? What types of support? So the third bullet there, what supports are work at home? So maybe in the context of homework, are there specific things that the family will do in order to support the child during homework time? And then that middle bullet, how is your child off the bus? We often know that children keep it together during the school day, and it's once they get off the bus or walk through that door that things kind of go haywire, right? And that meltdown occurs. So asking questions like that in the context of our present level is a really nice way to engage families in the discussion of the present level. Okay, so let's talk about some tips for school staff to help families understand achievement. The first is to acknowledge that parents are their child's first teacher, and it's sometimes difficult for families to trust that the information, observations, and perspectives shared by others really represents their child. It may take some time for families to understand and in some cases accept their child's level of achievement, and families need to know that you know their child and care before they can trust. Know the hopes and dreams of families for their child. So that's pretty self-explanatory. The next one, explain data in understandable terms. So that means everyone tries to avoid using jargon. Always try to take time to check for understanding or asking the question, does this make sense? Also, having a list of acronyms or terms that are defined and ready to go for the meeting is always helpful. The next one is giving concrete examples of student skills. So, and those are concrete examples of what achievement or expectations look like for that child. So for instance, sharing a book that is at the same reading level of where that child is. So if you use the Lexile score in your discussion of present level of achievement, you might show a book that actually represents what the student might be reading at that Lexile level. Providing options for families or multiple ways for families to provide input. What I mean by that is, do families like to provide input in a form where they could answer open-ended questions, or maybe a menu to check off items, or does a family prefer to share verbally, or perhaps the family would rather not share at all. So we have to recognize that as well. But just know that one size doesn't fit all. And then finally, look for ways to connect what the family shares about their child to what you notice in school. This is validating the family's contribution and helps to build confidence in the family, their ability to be a team member, and their respect and trust in the rest of the team. And then finally,
Yep, we're okay.
okay, we're doing well. So on this particular slide, I'm just sharing some resources that I think are really helpful in engaging families in this conversation of academic achievement and functional expectations. So the first one is the Positive Student Profile, which is an example of a questionnaire that a family member can fill out in advance of an IEP meeting. There are questions about the child's strengths and interests, future hopes and dreams for the student, as well as some other areas. WISBE is currently adapting the original Positive Student Profile to align with the CCR IEP 5-step process. And the next one is a reading survey for families. This was created by WISBE as a survey tool for school staff to learn from families about reading at home and what families would like to see more of or learn more about in order to help their child. The third one is Parents' Guide to Success. These are PTA guides, which are absolutely wonderful resource for school staff to share with families. The guides are for kindergarten through 8th grade. and they contain examples of standards that students would be working toward in English, language, arts, and math. There's also a high school a high school guide as well. That is, one high school guide is just focused on English, language, arts. The other guide is on math. Each guide contains conversation tips for families besides the standards. It also contains home-based strategies that families can do at home to reinforce or practice the standards identified. And then finally, the special ed acronym list from DPI. It's a great place to start. Every school district has a different list of special education terms and acronyms, so it's a nice resource to share with families. And then finally, I have 2 videos here that just get to that whole idea of setting high expectations for our kids with disabilities.
So now let's begin to summarize. Here is the step check for step 1. You can use this step check when you develop and/or review the first section of your IEP document, Student Strengths and Current Levels of Academic Achievement and Functional Performance. The step check asks you, 1, if all the required information is included, strengths, current academic achievement, functional performance data, etc. If the information is documented in a way that it can be understood by all IEP team participants, including the student's family members and the student. If it is clear how the student's performance compares to grade level or as appropriate early childhood standards and expectations. And finally, whether there is enough current information provided to develop the rest of the IEP.
And I meant to mention this earlier, but I'll mention it now, jotting down some notes as you're looking at this. How are you going to share this with other staff who are facilitating meetings, and how might you think about dealing with that and engaging families in this? How would you explain what you're doing in this step to parents during this meeting? So those are some thoughts.
So here's an activity you may want to use after the webinar to help you with step 1. Take an IEP you developed and review it with a partner or in a small group. Look at the sections that include the statements of the student's strengths and current academic achievement and functional performance. On the new I-4 form, this would be sections 1A and B. Review the IEP at a glance document that's in your handouts and use the step check from the at a glance document to decide if the IEP includes the necessary and pertinent information or if more information is needed.
Just to finish up this conversation, there's a number of resources on the DPI website. We've listed them here.
And I wanted to call out some of the resources here. Sherry has really given us a great perspective on how to bring forth parent voices, but we really haven't talked today about student voices at all. And I know in the resources there's some links to self-directed IEPs, which are an excellent tool to increase student participation. And I know, because I've seen it on this page, there's also a link to the I'm Determined website, which I think is outstanding for many different ages of students. And you can start to look at, in some ways, some of those functional kinds of skills too. So ways that you can prepare the student to participate in an IEP meeting.
Excellent. We wanted to share also with you our College and Career Ready IEP tool. This is a discussion tool. If you go to the College and Career Ready IEP webpage, you can find this discussion tool. And it also, if you click on 5-step process and effective disability, we have discussion starter questions that can also help out with you. We got a question. What are the preschool standards called? Who would like to take that?
Wisconsin,
Early
model, early.
learning standards.
I always think of WEMOS, Wisconsin Model Early Learning Standards.
Also, just like any of the other standards, our legislature has specified that districts are not required to adopt the model state standards. So we're using those as an example that the department has provided that districts may want to use.
There's a question. If students are taking alternate assessment and goals are essential elements, do we compare to grade level assessments? Who would like to take that question?
If you want me to.
I think, so the answer to that question is if the student is participating in grade level assessments with or without accommodations, then yes, you should explain how the student is doing in relation to them. If the student is participating in assessments that are using alternate standards, then you should explain that. It is, though, always good practice to always keep in mind that the alternate standards are aligned with grade level standards. So you are really talking about those, and it is, I think, always important to visit, even with kids with severe and the most severe cognitive disabilities, to keep a clear idea of what one would expect at that grade level. But I think the variation is that if a student's participating in alternate assessments, you will be talking about performance in relation to those. At the same time, you always will be keeping an idea of what are the typical developmental standards. Does anyone have anything to add to that? I see people, we have several.
I think that was good, and I think it's an important point that the essential elements are linked to the
grade level standards. They're derived from them.
We have one more really good question here, and then we're just going to wrap up with some resources and see if there's any final thoughts. This is a great one. We all know you cannot address every grade level standard in an IEP. How do we train teachers where to focus their time? That is a big, great question. Paula.
Okay, and I know Deb may have something to add because we've had this conversation. I've got this question quite a bit, and I think this has to do with preparation. Number one, and I'm going to make the assumption that most kids are in general ed most of the time. The general ed teachers should have a really good sense because their curriculum is built around the general ed standards. So they should have a sense of what standards kids are meeting and what aren't, which can help narrow some of the discussions down. So instead of using the IEP meeting to go through each standard, we were once doing an IEP of a student going over one of a student who I believe was in 7th or 8th grade, and someone pointed out there are 43 literacy standards at the 7th grade. The question is coming prepared to the meeting. So being aware of the standards, having a sense of the student, this is a really excellent thing to help to ask the general ed teachers who are involved, whether they're at the meeting, but hopefully if literacy is a big issue, it would be appropriate to have a general ed teacher. But to ask them ahead of time, what standards really is this child meeting and what standards aren't they? And I don't mean listing all of them. So I think from there you can narrow down the ones you need to focus on and the areas of focus rather than talking about each standard.
I think we can also in some ways build on Sherry's response because I think it depends on the student's strengths, the student's needs, and the student's age. And so if you have a student who's transition age, regardless of skill level, what are they getting ready for in the next environment, and what does this person need to focus on to be able to get ready for what the future holds for that learner.
I'll take the next question. It says, how much detail regarding grade level expectations should IEP include? And I think the answer to that is the first thing I would highly recommend is that the conversation be organized around, so what are the standards and expectations and how is this child doing, and have that conversation. But how much should be included in the document, as I assume in the I-4 in the linking form? Enough information so that you can understand what the data means that you're putting in there. So what is important is that section should both have present level as well as how that compares to expectations. So if you have a number of
let's talk about reading since we've been talking about reading a lot. If you're explaining what this student's reading level is, you might have information about decoding or comprehension or some of those skills as the data, depending upon the types of assessment you use. You would then make a simple note saying, kids at this grade level would be expected to be doing X. I think if students are meeting expectations, it's good enough to just include a simple statement saying the student is meeting expectations in all other academic areas, or the student is meeting all the school behavioral expectations. So I think statements that way. How much depends upon the conversation that you've been having.
There's another question. There's no info about Alex's organizational skills, but same question about functional performance.
Okay, so I think maybe there is under functional performance a lot of information about Alex's organizational skills, but perhaps not as much about other areas. So you can think about some of those areas that Daniel just listed. Organization is certainly one of them, and I suspect that the team saw that his organizational skills were impacting so many areas of his school and home life, and that's why that's emphasized. But what else is there for Alex besides organization? You know, how does he, certainly in terms of codes of conduct, it seems he gets along well with others, both other children and adults. But what are other functional skills that might be included for a fourth grader?
And if truly the only area of functional skill that is of any issue, it would be nice to see a statement saying, and Alex does not have any other functional skill deficits. I think really asking that question of yourself and the team is important. In other words, because sometimes we focus on a couple of things that we've historically focused on with a student and don't have a bigger conversation. So I think it's always a good idea before you move on to say, so is this really it? Can we comfortably say there are no other functional skill deficits? Just to kind of make sure we've talked about things like independence and self-advocacy and some of those other skills.
And Paula, I think that's a great example that you just gave of how the form isn't driving the discussion. The form is recording the discussion. And so if you make that really explicit, then it's evident the team has talked about that and kind of ended that conversation.
There was just a comment, I think, that there tends to be a focus on functional performance with students who might have an intellectual disability, and sometimes the academic achievement to the degree needed is not necessarily discussed. That's just an observation. One of the things also I might just add on in academic and functional, I know this has been touched on, but one way to visualize academic and functional is when you think about academic skills, think about functional skills that wrap around that academic skill. You know, so reading. There's a lot of things that involve the reading. I know that there's some great resources on the DPI website on how to help readers who struggle, if you Google that. And one of the big ideas of that is that how students think about reading, their self-efficacy around reading, especially older students who are really behind, has a big part to play in how they will or will not learn to read, and matching interventions to students, but also being attention to those internal social emotional factors that we have interventions that can work well for. You can have interventions that help build self-efficacy. So just think about those things in relation to, of course, that academic outcome.
I also think if the question is about the fact that we often don't focus enough or at all, or don't know how to focus on academic skills with kids with intellectual disabilities, I think looking at if the student is in the general standards, looking at those standards in light of what does that mean for this child. If we're looking at essential elements, I think it is including discussion about the essential elements that relate to the academic standards in that section. Hopefully separating those sections and asking some specific cues on the form and focusing on that separately in the first step of the process will help you actually focus on them. And I think Daniel's point of the linkages how we think of academics with kids who have more severe disabilities is really critical to not forget those things. Development of vocabulary, development of language, development of literacy for the most severe kids related to the essential elements. And we have one more thing to add to that, Sherry.
And if I could just pop in, as a parent of a young person who has an intellectual disability, oftentimes our conversations at the IEP team was what are our future hopes and dreams for employment and post-secondary ed. And as you have discussions about that, when you're looking to the future, you can't help but also have discussions about the academic piece of it, especially if the individual is to hold a job one day. What types of knowledge and skills will the individual need?
All right, well, that ends our questions for today. We want to thank everyone for your participation in these webinars, and there will be a survey. It will really help us if you take time to fill that out. But thank you, and we're going to go ahead and sign off. Take care.